10 Most Dangerous Gangsters in California's Corcoran. Inside Corcoran Prison. If you think you know what power looks like, you haven't seen the inside of Corcoran State Prison. Smash that subscribe button, drop a comment about which prison legend terrifies you most, and turn on notifications, because this story will show you that some men don't lose power when they go to prison, they multiply it. The California sun beat down on the concrete walls of Corcoran State Prison, but inside, the temperature was controlled by a different kind of heat. The kind that came from men who'd built empires on the streets and refused to let prison walls diminish their influence. And on the morning of June 12, 2018, that heat was about to ignite into something that would change the balance of power in California's most notorious facility. His name was Rafael the General Domingo, and by the time correctional officers found him, he'd been dead for approximately 4 hours. But it wasn't the death itself that shocked the veteran guards, who'd seen everything Corcoran could throw at them. It was the precision of the kill. Rafael had been one of the 10 most powerful inmates in the facility, a shot caller for the Mexican Mafia who controlled drug distribution, protection rackets, and violence on 3 entire cell blocks. Men like Rafael didn't die by accident. They died by declaration, by order, by someone powerful enough to sentence them despite their legendary status. The crime scene told a story that experienced investigators struggled to believe. Rafael's cell showed no signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle, no indication that he'd fought back against his attacker. The killing had been professional, surgical, executed with a weapon that had vanished as completely as the killer. In a maximum security environment where every movement was monitored, where cameras recorded 24 hours a day, where inmates were counted and accounted for constantly, someone had committed the perfect murder. Lieutenant Marcus Webb had worked at Corcoran for 15 years, climbing from correctional officer to senior investigator. He'd seen stabbings, riots, and gang warfare that would make civilians sick. But standing in Rafael's cell that morning, looking at a body that shouldn't exist according to all the rules of prison security, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine unease. "Sir, you need to see this," a young officer called from the cell's concrete bunk. He'd found something tucked beneath the thin mattress, something that made Marcus's blood run cold. It was a list, handwritten in precise block letters, containing 9 names. Each name belonged to one of Corcoran's most dangerous inmates, the gangsters and shot callers who controlled the facility's underground economy. And at the top of the list, already crossed out with a single red line, was Rafael Domingo's name. The message was clear. This wasn't a random killing or a personal grudge. This was an execution, the first move in a larger game that someone inside Corcoran's walls was playing. Someone was systematically targeting the prison's power structure, and they just announced their intentions with a body count of 1 and a promise of 8 more to follow. Marcus immediately ordered a facility-wide lockdown. No movement, no yard time, no privileges until they understood what they were dealing with. But as correctional officers began herding inmates back to their cells, Marcus noticed something that made his investigator instincts scream in alarm. The other 9 men on the list weren't showing fear. They weren't demanding protection or requesting transfers to different facilities. They were watching, waiting, almost expectant, like players in a game who just realized the board had changed but the rules remained the same. The second name on the list belonged to Antonio Ice Martinez, a leader in the Nuestra Familia, who controlled the Northern California Hispanic gang operations inside Corcoran. Marcus found him in the yard, surrounded by his crew, his expression neutral despite the fact that someone had just marked him for death. "Martinez, we need to talk," Marcus called out, flanked by 4 officers in full tactical gear. Ice turned slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. At 48 years old, he'd spent 30 years in the California prison system, climbing from street soldier to prison general through intelligence and ruthless efficiency. His face bore scars that told stories of survival, but his eyes showed something more dangerous: calculation. "About Rafael? Tragic loss for the community," I said, his voice carrying a hint of mockery that made Marcus's jaw tighten. "About the fact that you're second on a hit list, and you don't seem concerned." I smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Lieutenant Webb, You've been here long enough to know how this works. Raphael died because he forgot the most important rule of prison politics: adapt or become irrelevant. Someone's changing the game, and the smart players recognize when the board's been reset. Who's changing the game? That's the interesting question, isn't it? Because whoever's behind this, whoever killed Raphael without leaving evidence in the most monitored environment in California, they're not just powerful. They're invisible. And in here, invisibility is the ultimate power. Marcus felt the investigation shifting beneath his feet. This wasn't just about solving Raphael's murder. This was about understanding a conspiracy that involved inmates, possibly guards, and a mastermind who'd managed to orchestrate a perfect killing in an imperfect system. The list suggested 8 more deaths were planned. But what Marcus couldn't shake was the feeling that those deaths weren't the real goal. They were pieces being removed from a chessboard, clearing space for something bigger. That night, as Marcus reviewed security footage from Raphael's cell block, he discovered something that changed everything. For exactly 17 seconds, cameras in 3 strategic locations had experienced what the technical report called digital artifacts, brief moments of distortion that could be explained as system glitches. Except those 17 seconds covered the exact window when Raphael's killer would have needed to enter and exit the cell undetected. Someone had access to Corcoran's security systems. Someone who understood technology well enough to create blind spots without triggering alarms. And someone who was using that access to systematically eliminate the 10 most dangerous gangsters in California's most notorious prison. Marcus pulled up files on all 10 names from the list, spreading them across his desk like cards in a deadly game. Rafael Domingo, Mexican Mafia. Antonio Martinez, Nuestra Familia. James Prophet Williams, Black Guerrilla Family. Each name represented decades of criminal expertise, thousands of crimes, and control over millions of dollars in illegal operations. These weren't random targets. They were the foundation of Corcoran's power structure. But as Marcus studied the list more carefully, he noticed something that made his heart race. The names weren't arranged by gang affiliation or threat level or alphabetical order. They were arranged by something else, something he couldn't immediately identify. And at the bottom of the list, written in smaller letters, almost like a signature, were 3 words that would haunt his investigation for weeks to come: the board resets. Marcus looked up from his desk, staring through his office window at the prison yard below, and realized with chilling certainty that Raphael's murder wasn't the beginning of this story. It was just the moment when whatever had been building in Corcoran's shadows finally revealed itself. Someone had been planning this for months, maybe years, positioning pieces, building networks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And that someone was still out there, hidden among 3,000 inmates and 800 staff members, preparing to cross off the second name on their list, while Marcus raced against time to stop them. The question wasn't just who was behind the killings. The question was why the 10 most dangerous gangsters in Corcoran needed to die, and what kind of power vacuum their deaths would create in California's prison system. Because in Corcoran, power never disappeared. It just changed hands. And someone was orchestrating the biggest power transfer in the facility's violent history. Antonio "Ice" Martinez died 3 days later, and this time there were witnesses. Sort of. 23 inmates in the general population yard watched Ice walk from the wait area toward the basketball courts. 23 inmates saw him stop mid-stride, clutch his chest, and collapse onto the concrete. And 23 inmates swore under oath that nobody had touched him, that no weapon had been used, that Ice had simply dropped dead as if his heart had given out. The medical examiner's report confirmed what seemed impossible. Ice had died of cardiac arrest, triggered by a massive dose of potassium chloride injected directly into his bloodstream. But here's what made Lieutenant Marcus Webb's investigation spiral into nightmare territory. Ice had no injection marks, no puncture wounds, no physical evidence that anyone had administered anything. The potassium chloride was in his system, confirmed by 3 separate toxicology tests, but it had appeared there through a method that defied medical explanation. Marcus stood in the prison infirmary, staring at Ice's body on the examination table, feeling the ground shift beneath everything he thought he understood about investigation work. 2 names crossed off the list. 2 impossible deaths. And 8 more inmates waiting for their turn while Marcus chased shadows through a facility that suddenly felt less like a prison and more like a killing floor designed by someone who understood its every vulnerability. "Lieutenant, we have a problem." The voice belonged to Dr. Sarah Chun, Corcoran's chief medical officer, a woman who'd seen 30 years of prison medicine and maintained an unshakable clinical detachment. But her hands were trembling as she handed Marcus a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a small, empty vial recovered from the medical waste in the infirmary's secure disposal unit. "Potassium chloride," she said quietly. "High concentration, medical grade." This vial was logged into our inventory 3 weeks ago as part of a routine pharmaceutical shipment. It should still be in our locked medication storage. But according to our inventory system, it's exactly where it's supposed to be. Except it's also here, empty, in the disposal unit. Marcus felt ice water flood his veins. Someone duplicated your inventory records. Someone who has access to our pharmaceutical ordering system, our inventory management software, and our secure medication storage. Someone who could order extra vials, hide them in legitimate shipments, and make the digital records show everything was normal. Dr. Chen's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Marcus, that level of access requires passwords that change weekly, biometric authentication, and administrative privileges that only 3 people in this facility possess." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Either one of Corcoran's top administrators was orchestrating murders, or someone had compromised the facility's security so thoroughly that they could operate with impunity at the highest levels of access. Both options were terrifying. Both options meant that Marcus's investigation was being watched by the very person he was hunting. That afternoon, Marcus did something he'd never done in 15 years at Corcoran. He went off the grid. He drove 20 miles to a truck stop, bought a burner phone with cash, and called a number he'd sworn he'd never use again. The call connected after 4 rings. "Marcus Webb," a familiar voice answered. "I wondered when you call." Special Agent Diana Torres had been Marcus's partner back when he'd worked federal investigations before burnout drove him to the relative simplicity of prison security. She'd gone on to become one of the FBI's top specialists in institutional corruption, the kind of investigator who dismantled criminal conspiracies from the inside out. "I need help," Marcus said simply. Unofficial, off the books, completely deniable. "Corcoran's gangster killings. I've been watching the reports. 2 down, 8 to go if the rumors are accurate." Diana's voice sharpened with interest. "What aren't the reports saying?" Marcus told her everything. The list, the impossible executions, the compromised security systems, the pharmaceutical access. Diana listened in silence, and when Marcus finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Marcus, what you're describing isn't a vigilante taking out gang leaders. This is a systematic dismantling of prison power structures using methods that require state-level resources. Whoever's behind this has money, access, technical expertise, and most importantly, they have a reason that goes beyond simple revenge or justice. They're rebuilding something." "Rebuilding what?" "That's what we need to find out. Because in my experience, when someone systematically eliminates the top 10 power players in an environment, it's not to create chaos. It's to create opportunity. They're clearing the board for someone else to take control. The question is, who's the replacement?" Marcus returned to Corcoran with a plan. If the killer had compromised the facility's security systems, then Marcus would have to investigate using old-school methods. Paper trails, face-to-face interviews, human intelligence instead of digital surveillance. He started with the one person who might understand the strategic thinking behind the murders. James Prophet Williams, the 3rd name on the list. Prophet was 71 years old, a legend in California's Black Guerrilla Family who'd been incarcerated for 48 years. He'd seen everything the prison system could offer, survived race riots and gang wars, and earned a reputation for almost supernatural insight into institutional politics. Finding him in the library, surrounded by law books and classical literature, Marcus felt like he was approaching an oracle who might provide answers or riddles in equal measure. "Lieutenant Webb," Prophet said without looking up from his book, "you want to know why I'm not afraid of being third on that list?" "How did you?" "Because fear is what they expect, and I stopped doing what people expect in 1975. Sit down. We need to talk about what's really happening in Corcoran, and you're not going to like what I tell you." Marcus sat, and Prophet closed his book with deliberate care. Raphael and Ice weren't killed because they were dangerous. They were killed because they were obsolete. The prison system is changing, Marcus. Private contracts, corporate interests, political manipulation. This isn't about gangs anymore. This is about money, billions of dollars flowing through corrections budgets. And someone's decided that the old power structure is interfering with their business model. What business model? Control. Not just of Corcoran, but of the entire California prison system. Those 10 names on the list? We're the last generation of gangsters who remember when prisons were about survival and respect. The new generation, they're about efficiency, profit margins, systematic exploitation. Someone's eliminating us to make room for a more corporate model of criminal enterprise. And that someone has resources that make our street operations look like children playing cops and robbers. Marcus's mind raced through the implications. If you're right, then the killer isn't just targeting gang leaders. They're targeting a way of life, an entire system of prison politics. Exactly. And when they finish with us, when all 10 names are crossed off that list, Corcoran won't be run by gangsters anymore. It'll be run by whoever's orchestrating these murders. Someone with enough power to compromise your security, your medical systems, your entire institutional infrastructure. Someone who's been planning this for years. A correctional officer appeared at the library door, his face pale. "Lieutenant, we have another situation. You need to come to D Block immediately." Marcus felt his stomach drop as he ran through corridors he'd walked 1,000 times, each step bringing him closer to a scene he already knew would be impossible to explain. The fourth name on the list was Victor Nightmare Reeves, a shot caller for the Aryan Brotherhood who controlled drug manufacturing and distribution across 3 California prisons. Marcus found him in his cell, dead, with no visible cause, no signs of violence. No explanation that would satisfy any rational investigation. But what made Marcus's blood run cold wasn't the body. It was the message written on the cell wall in what appeared to be Victor's own blood, though the medical team would later confirm it was synthetic, planted to look authentic. The message was simple, direct, and utterly terrifying. 6 remain. The board resets in 72 hours. Choose sides carefully. Marcus stumbled out of the cell, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. For deaths in less than 2 weeks. For impossible executions. And now a deadline, a countdown to some event that would apparently force everyone in Corcoran, inmates and staff alike, to choose sides in a war nobody fully understood. As he stood in that corridor, surrounded by correctional officers who looked to him for answers he didn't have, Marcus's burner phone vibrated. A text from Diana Torres, containing a single piece of information that made everything infinitely worse. Check your warden's financial records. $3 million deposited in offshore accounts over the past 18 months. Source unknown. Marcus, the corruption goes to the top. Trust no one. Marcus deleted the message and looked around at the guards, the administrators, the entire institutional infrastructure of Corcoran State Prison. Somewhere in this facility, someone with ultimate authority was orchestrating murders, manipulating systems, and preparing for a transfer of power that would reshape California's entire corrections landscape. And Marcus had 72 hours to stop them before 6 more men died, and whatever was being built in Corcoran's shadows finally revealed itself. The question wasn't just who was behind the killings anymore. The question was whether Marcus could solve the case before he became a liability that needed to be eliminated. Because in Corcoran, investigators who got too close to the truth had a habit of disappearing into the same shadows that had swallowed 4 of California's most dangerous gangsters. And the clock was ticking down toward a deadline that promised either revelation or catastrophe, with no middle ground in between. Marcus Webb spent the next 48 hours doing something that would either save his life or end his career. He stopped trusting the system entirely. No digital communications, no official reports, no conversations in rooms that might be monitored. He operated like a fugitive in his own facility, building a case using methods that belonged to a different era of investigation. What he discovered made him understand why 4 men had died and why 6 more were marked for execution. The pattern wasn't about gang affiliation or criminal history. It was about knowledge. Each of the 10 gangsters on that list had been in Corcoran long enough to remember how the facility operated before the privatization contracts started flowing in, before the pharmaceutical supply chains were outsourced to corporate vendors, before the entire infrastructure became a profit center disguised as a corrections facility. Rafael Domingo had witnessed irregularities in medication distribution. Ice Martinez had questioned construction contracts that never resulted in finished projects. Victor Reeves had compiled evidence of guards smuggling not just contraband, but falsified medical records that allowed private healthcare companies to bill the state for treatments that never happened. And Prophet Williams, the old man who'd seen everything, had been documenting it all for years, building a case from inside his cell that would expose systematic fraud reaching into the billions of dollars. They weren't being killed because they were dangerous criminals. They were being killed because they were witnesses to the greatest prison corruption scandal in California history. And the mastermind wasn't some invisible puppet master operating from the shadows. It was Warden Richard Holloway, the man who'd run Corcoran for 8 years, who'd overseen every privatization contract, every outsourced service, every corporate partnership that had turned the facility into a revenue stream for companies that viewed inmates as billable units rather than human beings. Marcus sat in his truck in the prison parking lot as dawn broke over Corcoran, the burner phone in his hand showing a text from Diana Torres. FBI raid authorized. Team moving in 6 hours. Get yourself somewhere safe. But Marcus couldn't wait 6 hours. The deadline Prophet had mentioned, 72 hours for the board to reset. That deadline was now. Today. And Marcus understood with chilling clarity what it meant. Holloway wasn't just eliminating witnesses. He was preparing to transfer control of Corcoran's entire criminal enterprise to a new generation of inmates who'd been carefully cultivated, who understood their role not as gangsters, but as business partners in a system that monetized every aspect of incarceration. Marcus entered the facility through the main gate, his badge triggering security protocols that seemed suddenly ominous. Every camera, every checkpoint, every locked door was part of the system Holloway controlled. But Marcus had one advantage that the warden hadn't anticipated. The old gangsters, the men on that death list, they'd seen Marcus's investigation, recognized his integrity, and made a decision that went against every instinct developed over decades in prison. They'd chosen to trust a cop. Marcus found Prophet Williams in the medical ward, supposedly being treated for chest pains that were really just an excuse to move him out of general population. The old man looked up as Marcus entered, his eyes showing a mixture of resignation and something that might have been hope. "You've figured it out," Prophet said quietly. "You've known all along. All 10 of you. You weren't targets chosen at random. You volunteered to be on that list because you knew exposing Holloway's operation required proof he couldn't destroy. Bodies. Deaths that would trigger investigations even he couldn't control." Prophet smiled sadly. "Not bad for a corrections lieutenant. Yeah, we figured it out about 18 months ago. Holloway's been building something that turns prisons into profit centers, using inmates as commodities, skimming millions while conditions deteriorate and men die from neglect. We couldn't report it through normal channels because he controlled all the channels. So we did what old criminals do best. We became evidence he couldn't erase. 4 of us are already gone. 6 of us are still waiting. I'm not letting 6 more men die to make a case." "Then you better move fast, Lieutenant, because Holloway's endgame starts in about 30 minutes. He's scheduled a facility-wide meeting in the administration building. All senior staff, all department heads. He's going to announce some new security protocols. But what he's really doing is consolidating control before the FBI shows up. He knows they're coming. He's got people everywhere. Marcus's radio crackled with an all-staff announcement. Mandatory meeting, administration building, 15 minutes. He looked at Prophet, understanding the trap being set. He's going to eliminate anyone who might testify against him. Staff members who've seen too much, asked too many questions, including one particularly persistent lieutenant who's been investigating impossible murders. Yeah, Marcus, you're not just hunting a killer anymore. You've become a target. The next 15 minutes moved with a surreal clarity that comes with absolute danger. Marcus didn't go to the meeting. Instead, he went to the one place in Corcoran where Holloway surveillance couldn't reach, the old storage facility in Section G, a building scheduled for demolition that had been offline for months. And there, hidden in file boxes that should have been destroyed years ago, Marcus found what Prophet and the others had been protecting. Documentation going back a decade. Pharmaceutical orders that never arrived but were billed to the state. Construction projects paid in full but never completed. Medical treatments charged to insurance companies for inmates who died months earlier. Ghost prisoners who existed only on paper but generated revenue through housing fees, meal allowances, and program costs. Holloway had turned Corcoran into a machine that produced money by exploiting every gap between reported services and actual care. The corruption was so systematic, so thoroughly documented, that Marcus understood why witnesses needed to die. This wasn't just about covering up fraud. This was about protecting a model that could be replicated across California's entire prison system, generating billions in fraudulent revenue for corporations and corrupt officials who'd partnered with Holloway. Marcus's burner phone buzzed. Diana Torres, FBI team on site. Where are you? But before Marcus could respond, the lights in the storage facility died. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in red shadows. And Warden Richard Holloway stepped through the doorway, flanked by two guards Marcus didn't recognize, private security contractors who wore corrections uniforms but answered to someone else entirely. Lieutenant Webb, Holloway said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd spent years perfecting institutional control. I have to admire your persistence. Most people would have accepted the simple explanation. Gang violence, institutional brutality, just another day in corrections. But you kept digging. You found the bodies that were supposed to look random, the deaths that were supposed to discourage further investigation. And now you've found the evidence that explains everything. The FBI is already here, Marcus said, his hand moving slowly toward his service weapon. The FBI is in the administration building, following protocols I helped write, being directed by staff I've carefully cultivated for exactly this scenario. They'll find nothing because there's nothing to find in any system I control. The evidence you're holding? That's the last copy. The digital records were erased months ago. Those file boxes? They're about to be destroyed in a tragic fire that will also claim the life of a troubled corrections officer who became obsessed with conspiracy theories. The guards moved forward, but Marcus had been preparing for this moment since he'd understood the scope of Holloway's operation. He'd spent 15 years at Corcoran, learning every blind spot, every vulnerability, every flaw in the security systems Holloway thought he controlled absolutely. And he'd spent the last 2 days preparing a backup plan that didn't rely on technology or institutional authority. He'd relied on the oldest form of prison communication, human networks that operated entirely outside official channels. The inmates Holloway was trying to eliminate had spread the word through methods that predated surveillance cameras and digital monitoring. And when Marcus triggered the emergency alarm using a manual pull station that couldn't be overridden remotely, every gang member, every shot caller, every inmate who'd lost friends to Holloway's corruption scheme responded. The resulting chaos was controlled, targeted, and absolutely devastating. Inmates didn't riot. They simply stopped cooperating with any order given by guards associated with Holloway's operation. They created human barriers blocking access to key areas. They triggered legitimate security responses that forced the facility into protocols even Holloway couldn't countermand. And in the confusion, Marcus escaped the storage facility and delivered his evidence directly to Diana Torres and her FBI team. The raid that followed would become legendary in federal law enforcement circles. Holloway was arrested along with 14 staff members, 6 corporate executives, and 2 state officials who'd been part of the fraud scheme. The evidence Marcus recovered led to a 3-year investigation that ultimately exposed corruption across California's entire privatized prison system, recovering over $2 billion in fraudulent charges and leading to comprehensive reforms in how corrections contracts were awarded and monitored. But the story Marcus would never forget happened in the days immediately following Holloway's arrest. The remaining 6 gangsters on that death list, the ones who'd volunteered to be targets, who'd been willing to die to expose the truth, they survived. Prophet Williams was eventually released due to age and health considerations, spending his final years as an advocate for prison reform, speaking at universities and policy conferences about the humanity too often lost in discussions of corrections. Marcus left Corcoran 6 months later, joining Diana's FBI unit as a specialist in institutional corruption. But he returned once, a year after Holloway's conviction, to visit the memorial that inmates had created in the facility's chapel. It listed 4 names: Rafael Domingo, Antonio Martinez, Victor Reeves, and James Washington, men who died not as criminals, but as witnesses who'd sacrificed everything to expose a system that had lost its way. Standing in that chapel, Marcus understood something profound about justice and redemption. The 10 most dangerous gangsters in Corcoran hadn't been eliminated by corruption. They'd fought back against it, using the only weapons available to men society had written off as irredeemable. They'd used their lives, their deaths, and their legend to prove that even in California's darkest prison, human dignity could still matter more than institutional profit. 3 years later, a similar pattern of deaths appeared at another California facility. Impossible murders, systematic targeting, a list of names that shouldn't exist. But this time, investigators knew what to look for. This time, they understood that sometimes the most dangerous criminals aren't the ones behind bars. They're the ones wearing badges and signing contracts that turn human lives into line items on a corporate balance sheet. And somewhere in California, in a system that had been forced to confront its own corruption, men who'd spent their lives as criminals were being remembered not for their crimes, but for their courage. Because they'd learned the hardest lesson of all, that redemption doesn't always look like walking free. Sometimes it looks like refusing to stay silent, even when silence is the only thing keeping you alive. If this story showed you that justice can come from the most unexpected places, that truth matters even in the darkest institutions, then you're beginning to understand. Because the real danger isn't always behind prison walls. Sometimes it's in the systems we trust blindly, the authorities we don't question, the corruption that operates in plain sight because we've stopped paying attention. Hit subscribe if you want more stories that expose what really happens when power goes unchecked and ordinary people refuse to stay silent.